Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah O'Gorman, and today, along with my fellow speakers, Shwea, Julia, Ryan, and Jordan, we are going to analyse the action research approach to a study on migrant women and homelessness by Paula Maycock and Sarah Sheridan. So, what is action research? Action research is an interactive method of inquiry undertaken by researchers in order to analyse a particular issue and in turn improve this problem. Action research can be split up into two different stages. The first is the diagnostic stage, and the second is the therapeutic stage. The diagnostic stage is where the researcher collects their information and introduces it to the individuals who are set to participate in the study. The therapeutic stage involves the action taking, evaluation, and identification of observations gathered throughout the course of the study. There are three underlying assumptions of action research. The first is the ontological assumption, which is very value orientated. This is demonstrated in the article as family and personal values are reiterated constantly throughout the article. As seen below, a 30-year-old migrant woman outlines her concerns related to both family and personal values. In the first situation, she emphasises her family values as she is incapable of funding the childcare for her children. In the second situation, she outlines how her personal values are challenged as she refrains from informing her family on her current situation. The second underlying assumption is the epistemological assumption, which tells us that generating knowledge is a collaborative process. Gathering information on migrant women cannot be done individually, and therefore the interview aspect of action research exemplifies the cooperation between the researcher and the individuals being interviewed. The third is the methodological assumption, where the vision is to enhance learning while simultaneously incorporate the social aspect. While the study involves the expansion of the knowledge horizon, the holistic approach, including migration, homelessness, and ethnicity, demonstrates the social aspect which is so effective in action research.
So, moving on to some of the key findings found within this article, one of the main issues highlighted was that relationship breakdown for migrant women placed women in an economic and social negative paradoxical situation. Relationship breakdown mainly occurred due to domestic violence within the household. It left these women excluded from housing and labour opportunities and also from welfare assistance due to the habitual residence condition. The habitual residence condition meant that a lot of these women were not eligible as a result of their migrant status. All of this occurred while a lot of these women were also in the care of children, resulting in many women being afraid to disclose domestic abuse by their partners to the relevant authorities. Migrant women were also afraid to report domestic abuse by their partners for fear of labels of being homeless or abused and being attached to them and leaving them socially isolated from their communities, family members, etc. So, this situation was a double edged sword for a lot of these migrant women. They're afraid of reporting domestic abuse to relevant authorities for fear of exclusion from social groups and perceived weakness by others due to these labels of abuse and homeless being attached to them, while also being afraid to report their situations due to lack of welfare supports available to them. All of this meant that domestic abuse went on for longer than it should have within the household. Another interesting finding which was highlighted was the lack of knowledge that these women had on available supports and also their fear of being ineligible for these services due to their migrant status. The lack of proficiency that these women had in the English language also meant that it was harder for them to know what supports were available to them. Finally, 5 out of 17 migrant women said that a sudden loss of income is what triggered their homeless situation. This sudden loss of income, coupled up with the fact that it was harder for them to regain employment once this income was lost as a result of their migrant status, meant that this homeless situation was likely to last for a lot longer. Moving on, we will talk about the rigor and relevance of these findings.
Hi everyone, I'm Shreya Shum and I'm gonna to introduce key elements of the article. Qualitative research involves collecting and analyzing non-numerical data like text, video, or audio to understand the concepts, opinions, or experiences. It can be used to gather in-depth insights into a problem or generate new ideas for research. A focus group is a qualitative research method in which a trained moderator conducts a collective interview of typically 6 to 8 participants for similar backgrounds, similar demographic characteristics, or both. And in this article, the woman was selected for participation through contact with numerical homeless or domestic violence services in Dublin, Cork, and Galway. In order to participate, women had to be currently homeless or to have experienced homelessness during the 6 months period to interview. And in this article, we have 4 data collection methods. The first one is the conduct of a detailed life history interview with all participating women. The second one is the administration of a questionnaire which aimed to collect data on women's housing and homeless history, education, families, and children. The third one is the conduct of ethnographic observation at 4 homeless service settings in Dublin. The final one is the involvement of a small number of the women in a photography project. And in this 4 methods, the main is interview method. An interview is generally a qualitative research technique which involves asking open-ended questions to converse with respondents and collect illicit data about the subject. The findings presented here demonstrate that migrant women's homelessness is connected to a host of vulnerabilities and deprivations, all of them strongly associated with their gender and socio-economic position. Marginality within context of economic adversity was at the core of migrant women's accounts of becoming homeless.
Moving on now to the rigor and relevance. Starting off with a definition for both rigorous and relevant research. Rigorous research is research that meets the standards of scientific research. It is research that has been conducted according to the scientific model of research, subject to peer review, and published in an academic journal. Whereas relevant research is research that is of immediate relevance to business professionals and the results can be used straight away. This here is a table which shows how an article can display both high rigor and high relevance. So in order to have high rigor and high relevance, the article should use application of academic frameworks to practitioner problems, and its intended audience should be both academics and practitioners. Analysing now whether the article is relevant or rigorous. In terms of relevance, we could say that the article was intended for professionals. The HSE did fund part of this research, and in that sense, you could say practitioners and professionals had a certain degree of interest in this research piece. In line with other relevant research pieces, this piece does also have a lack of theoretical contribution. In terms of rigor, the research was conducted by academics, intended for academics, as the Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences also provided funding for the project. And Trinity College Dublin had a role to play in the research as well. There is also evidence in the acknowledgements that this piece has been peer reviewed, which is again in line with rigorous research. Is the article both rigorous and relevant? There is evidence that would support that the article is both rigorous and relevant, such as its intended audience. We could say that it was intended for both professionals and academics. However, thinking back to the table a few slides ago, did state that articles of high rigor and high relevance should have an application of academic frameworks. There wasn't much evidence of this to be found in this research piece. There's only 6 references throughout the report. However, this is very likely due to the nature of the report, as most of the information came from interviews with the women themselves.
I will be looking at if the theoretical framework, research methods, and data collection techniques were worthwhile in regards to the research goal of finding out more about migrant women's pathways to homelessness. This was an inductive study that hoped to discover more about homelessness and to build an understanding and theories regarding what causes homelessness for migrant women and their experiences during it. Regarding the inductive approach, the study was successful in that it was able to collect qualitative data from observing and listening to migrant women, and from there discovering key influences that led to their homelessness, such as the patterns of intimate partner violence, economic difficulties, and difficulties because of their migrant status. Their desire to learn about women's lives in depth was best executed by qualitative research, which was successfully used in this study, along with triangulation, in which they used 5 different data collection techniques that varied in their research methods. This research project had much more of an emphasis on primary data than secondary data, which was displayed by an absence of a literature review and only having 6 sources. Their primary data collection techniques were quite successful and were able to lead to the conclusions, along with adding value and credibility to their study. But the lack of secondary data could lead to questions of the initial research in the stage of the proposal. It seems that most of the information came through the interviews, questionnaires, and possibly the focus group. But based on the level of depth of most of the findings, it could be assumed that the life course interviews were the most prevalent data collection technique in the study. For this one-on-one process is where the researchers were able to collect most of the personal information and stories that were able to help them connect more deeply with the experiences of the participants in this study. Through this, it seemed they learned a lot about the lives of the women prior to their migrating to Ireland, their families, their children, and the external obstacles that have come between the women and their ability to gain income and/or housing. In this, they seem to use an interpretive case study approach that seeks simply to understand the phenomena of migrant women's increasing homelessness in Ireland through the meanings assigned by the migrant women interviewed. Another key element of this study seems to be the ethnographic observation that occurred in 4 different homeless service settings in Dublin. This ethnographic method did not seem to be as reflected in the study because in key findings presented in the research paper, there's much more discussion of the things that led to these women's homelessness and less discussion regarding their experience while homeless and the experiences in the shelter. Though they do discuss ongoing obstacles that have made it difficult for these women to exit homelessness, such as being unable to get a job due to their migrant status, there does not seem to be much talked about that was gathered from observations within the shelters. Overall, all of the methods were successful in gaining the data and theories on the pathways of migrant women's homelessness in Ireland, for they were able to get an in-depth look on the women's lives and what led them to their current situation. And the researchers were able to come to the conclusion that homelessness for migrant women is tied to many vulnerabilities and deprivations that are strongly associated with their gender and socioeconomic position.